Daniel had always been a man of measured curiosity, someone who kept his distance from the world of tabloid gossip and the fevered search for celebrity scandal. But that didn't mean he was blind to the allure of it all, especially when the subject in question was someone like Angelina Jolie. She was not just a name, but an institution, a star whose life appeared to be wrapped in the kind of mystery that made people want to dig deeper, to uncover something beneath the polished surface. The tabloids loved her, but they never quite reached her, and that distance between the public and the truth seemed to attract a certain kind of hunger in those who lived in the shadows of fame. It was on a cold, gray Thursday afternoon when it began. Daniel had just wrapped up a long, frustrating meeting at his paper's office, a newsroom cluttered with old newspapers, discarded coffee cups, and the hum of quiet phones ringing off their hooks. He was at a stage in his career where the stories didn't come as easily as they once did, and most of his peers were already eyeing the next opportunity. But Daniel had always been a fighter, unwilling to let go of the idea that there was still a story worth finding, even in a world that seemed to have exhausted its secrets. That was when he first heard the name. It was an offhand comment made by Carl Montgomery, a reporter from the gossip desk who, until then, had been little more than a distant acquaintance. Carl had a reputation for enjoying the more ridiculous aspects of the celebrity world, the kinds of stories that often lacked substance but fed the public's desire for scandal. His desk was always littered with clippings of half-truths, colorful rumors and gossip that everyone knew had been fabricated but somehow still sold like hotcakes. "Have you heard the latest about Angelina?" Carl had asked, almost to himself, as he sifted through a stack of freshly printed tabloids. Daniel had barely acknowledged the question at first, too absorbed in his thoughts about a much larger investigation he'd been working on. But Carl's voice lingered in the air, pulling at his attention, like the soft tug of a fishing line in deep waters. "No. What's the buzz?" Daniel had finally asked, turning his chair to face the reporter. Carl leaned forward, eyes gleaming, with the sort of enthusiasm Daniel had seen in rookie reporters, hungry, eager to prove something, yet unaware of the dangers they were about to chase. "You didn't hear? It's bigger than all that Brad and Angelina stuff," Carl said, grinning, like he was about to share a precious secret. "There's something darker going on. People are saying she's been living a double life. Some weird connections, some strange places she's been visiting. It's not just the usual Hollywood drama." Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply let the words hang in the air, letting them settle over him like a soft mist. He didn't believe in the sensationalism that often surrounded the likes of Jolie. After all, Hollywood was a machine, and machines were best understood when their cogs were kept in their proper places. But something about Carl's delivery struck a chord. It wasn't the type of gossip Daniel had heard countless times before. It was something more cryptic, something that piqued his interest. The next few days passed in the usual blur of office, work, routine meetings, and deadlines. But Daniel couldn't shake the thought that lingered from Carl's casual comment. He hadn't expected it to become anything significant, just another fleeting tidbit of information that would fade from memory as quickly as it had appeared. But as days stretched into nights, his curiosity gnawed at him, urging him to explore further. It wasn't that Daniel was drawn to the idea of a scandal, or that he believed Carl's words were anything more than another reporter's attempt to stir up the pot. It was the shadow of mystery that followed Jolie around, the gaps in her perfect public image that left so much open to interpretation. And then, there was the way people spoke about her, never with the sharp criticisms that so often accompanied other public figures, but with a hushed reverence, as if she were someone just out of reach, someone whose story was told only by those who could shape it in the most favorable light. But Daniel was a journalist, and journalists dug for the truth. He couldn't let the whisper of something larger than what was visible fade away without at least trying to uncover more. It wasn't about Jolie, not really. It was about the story, the chase, the pursuit of what lay beneath the surface. And so he set out to investigate, though he had no idea how far the rabbit hole went. Daniel's first step was to reach out to an old friend who had worked in the entertainment industry years ago. Martin Hayes had once been a private investigator, the type who worked on the fringes, taking on cases that others might have considered too dangerous or too obscure. He'd long since left the business of finding missing persons and exposing lies behind, but his connections and knowledge of the underworld that existed behind the glitzy facade of Hollywood had always intrigued Daniel. The two met at a small, dimly lit diner on the edge of the city. Martin was older now, his hair streaked with gray, and his once sharp eyes had softened with time. He ordered a black coffee and stared into the cup for a long moment, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "You've got something on Jolie, huh?" Martin had asked, leaning back in his seat. There was no judgment in his tone, just a quiet recognition that Daniel had walked into something much larger than he expected. Daniel nodded, not sure how to explain the sensation that had been building inside him. He didn't have much, just the vague outlines of a story that seemed to be slipping through his fingers every time he tried to grasp it. But there was a pattern, a strange absence of details, a trail of questions that seemed to lead nowhere, yet somehow everywhere. "I've heard things," Daniel confessed. "Rumors, really. And I know it sounds like the typical Hollywood nonsense, but something about this doesn't sit right with me. What if she's hiding something bigger than anyone realizes?" Martin's gaze remained fixed on him, studying him carefully. "You're not wrong to be cautious. The thing about Angelina Jolie is that she's always been bigger than her own persona. People put her on a pedestal, but they don't really see her. Not the real her." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't what Martin had said, so much as how he'd said it, with an air of knowing, as if he had witnessed the truth firsthand and was now trying to warn Daniel about the dangers of chasing it. "You can dig," Martin continued, his voice lowering as though sharing a secret that didn't belong in the open. "But remember, some people don't want to be found, and some stories aren't meant to be told." Despite the warning, Daniel couldn't stop himself. He knew that once the wheels of investigation were set in motion, they would not stop until they uncovered something, no matter how deep or dark it might be. The question now was whether he was prepared to face the truth of whatever he might find. But as he stood up to leave, a cold feeling settled in his chest, an unsettling thought that he hadn't considered before. What if he wasn't the one uncovering the truth? What if it was the truth that was uncovering him? The next few days were a blur of quiet determination and mounting uncertainty. Daniel could feel the weight of the story he was about to chase, the one that would inevitably change everything. At first, it seemed like just another investigative report, a glimpse behind the carefully constructed persona of one of the world's most famous women. But as Daniel sat at his cluttered desk, he realized that what he was about to uncover was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just the rumors, the whispers, or the tabloid fodder. It was something deeper, something darker. He had taken Martin's words to heart, but that only fueled his resolve. He knew that this was no longer about a simple story. The more he thought about the strange inconsistencies in Jolie's public life, the more convinced he became that there was something lurking beneath the surface, something that needed to be exposed. Daniel's first step was to track down any information about Angelina Jolie's activities outside of her public appearances, interviews, and charity work. He combed through old articles, press releases, and even the most obscure blog posts about her. What stood out most was the pattern of absences, times when she seemed to vanish from the public eye, disappearing for weeks or months without explanation. There were gaps in her known schedule that were never addressed, as though someone was carefully curating a narrative to keep her away from scrutiny. As he dug deeper, he found something that raised his eyebrows. Several months ago, there had been reports of Jolie visiting countries that were not on her usual list of humanitarian destinations, places like Moldova, Syria, and even North Korea. While her charity work was well known, and these countries had seen their fair share of attention from global organizations, something about these particular visits seemed off. Why was she there? Who had she met with? The public never got the full picture, and the media was content to allow it to slip under the radar. Daniel spent hours in the archive rooms of his paper, sifting through years of articles, photographs, and documents, hoping to find something that would make sense of these strange absences. He pieced together reports of Jolie's travels, piecing together fragments of time like a puzzle, but each discovery seemed to only raise more questions. It was at this point that he realized he needed help. The investigation had grown too complex, too layered for one person to handle alone. That's when he decided to call in Martin once again. Martin had connections, an entire network of people who worked in the underbelly of the entertainment industry, people who could pull strings and find things that others would never notice. He was the key to digging deeper into the story. When Daniel reached out to Martin, he found the investigator reluctant, even more hesitant than he had been before. Martin had always been cautious, but this time, it felt like a genuine sense of fear in his voice. Still, he agreed to meet. The two men sat in the same diner where they had spoken before, but the air between them was different now. The urgency was palpable. Martin's fingers tapped nervously against his cup, his eyes flickering around as though someone might be watching. "I don't like this, Daniel," Martin confessed, his voice lower than usual. "There's something about this story that's bigger than you realize. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Daniel leaned in, his tone firm but not unkind. He had seen Martin take on difficult cases before, ones that bordered on the impossible. This, he felt, was no different. "I need to know more. You've got the connections. You've seen the kind of people she's involved with. What's really going on?" Martin hesitated, then sighed deeply, as if weighing the consequences of his next words. "It's not just about Jolie, it's about the people she's associated with. Powerful people. People who don't play by the same rules you and I do." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Daniel had expected this. He had known, deep down, that the story he was chasing wouldn't be simple. But hearing it from Martin only solidified the gravity of the situation. "Who are these people?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. Martin shook his head. "I can't say too much, but I'll tell you this. Jolie's not just a celebrity, not just a humanitarian. She's involved in something far darker. I've seen it, but I've never had the guts to go after it. You want the truth, Daniel? It's not just about her double life. It's about the world she's a part of. And that world, it's dangerous." Despite the warning, Daniel was undeterred. The more Martin spoke, the more he realized that the story was slipping through his fingers, just beyond his reach. He had come too far to turn back now. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel started digging into Jolie's past, focusing on the people who had once been close to her, former friends, colleagues, and even lovers who had disappeared from the public eye. He found a few, but their stories were never quite complete. There were whispers of secretive meetings, late-night phone calls with foreign diplomats, and cryptic messages sent to people whose names were never fully revealed. Each clue only served to add layers to the mystery. It was then that Daniel found something that made him pause, a name that kept appearing in the background of Jolie's life, like a shadow that could never quite be shaken. This name had surfaced in several of her known charity projects and in obscure articles that barely made the headlines. The name was Gabriel Carter, and though little was known about him, he seemed to be tied to everything. A businessman with deep connections to various governments, a man who had his fingers in every pie from the entertainment industry to arms dealing, Gabriel Carter was a figure that seemed to orbit around Jolie in ways that Daniel couldn't ignore. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Daniel contacted an old friend who worked as a journalist in Eastern Europe, someone who had connections in both the political and criminal underworld. After a tense conversation, his friend revealed that Gabriel Carter had been involved in several shady dealings in Moldova, where Jolie had visited several times in the past few years. The fact that she had been there, meeting with such a man, was no coincidence. As Daniel processed the information, he began to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. This was no longer just about a hidden affair or a fabricated scandal. What he was uncovering was something much more sinister, a tangled web of corruption and power that stretched across borders and involved some of the most dangerous people in the world. Jolie, for all her fame and goodwill, was not the innocent figure the world believed her to be. She had become a part of something larger, a piece in a puzzle that, once completed, would expose the dark underbelly of global power struggles. By the time Daniel had pieced together enough of the story to make a report, he knew that he was standing on the precipice of something monumental. But he also knew that he had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. As much as he wanted to expose the truth, he felt the growing pressure from forces that were clearly trying to stop him. They were watching him now, just as they had watched Martin before him. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous the game became. And soon, it would be no longer about the truth, but about survival. But there was no going back. Daniel was too far in. The story had taken root in his mind, and it would not let go. The question now was whether he could bring the truth to light, or whether the truth would swallow him whole. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of Daniel's investigation began to feel like a pressure that bore down on him, constant and unyielding. The deeper he went, the more isolated he became, his sense of reality blurring. At first, it had all seemed like another story to chase, another mystery to unravel. But now, with every new revelation about Angelina Jolie's hidden life, he could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just the secrets about her that unnerved him. It was the forces at play behind them, the shadowy figures that seemed to orchestrate every move. It had all started with the cryptic phone call Martin received, the one that had warned them both of the danger they were stepping into. Daniel tried to dismiss it as paranoia, another layer of fear designed to scare him off the trail. But as he sifted through more documents, made more connections, and unearthed more of the truth about Jolie's ties to dangerous people, he began to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Martin had been right. This wasn't just a celebrity scandal. This wasn't even just about Jolie anymore. This was about a system of power that reached far beyond Hollywood, a network of influence, manipulation, and corruption that had been carefully concealed from the public eye. And now, it was becoming clear to Daniel that he wasn't just digging into a story. He was digging into a dangerous web that had already started to tighten around him. It started with subtle things, late-night phone calls that went unanswered, a sense of being watched that Daniel couldn't shake, like someone was always just out of sight. The first real sign that something was wrong came when he returned to his apartment one evening to find that his computer had been tampered with. It wasn't a break-in. Nothing had been taken, but the files he had been working on were gone. His research, the interviews, the notes, all erased. It was a professional job, one that left no trace, just a sense of deep, unsettling loss. He called Martin immediately, but when the phone rang through to voicemail, he felt a surge of panic. Something was happening, and he wasn't sure who was behind it or how far it reached. For the first time, he considered the possibility that this wasn't just about uncovering a story. It was about survival. The next day, a package arrived at his office. No return address, just a plain envelope with a single sheet of paper inside. He opened it slowly, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. It was a photograph, an old, grainy image of Martin and Daniel sitting in the diner a few weeks earlier. The photograph was taken from a distance, but it was clear that someone had been watching them. There was no note, no words, just the chilling implication that someone knew exactly where they were, what they were doing, and who they were talking to. The message was clear: stop looking. Daniel's heart raced as he stared at the photograph, the reality of his situation sinking in. He had always known that digging into the truth could be dangerous, but this was something else entirely. Whoever was watching him wasn't playing by the same rules. He wasn't sure if they were the ones pulling the strings behind Jolie's double life, but it was becoming clear that they were more than willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was this close. He had to find out who was behind it all, who was pulling Jolie's strings, and why she had become involved with such dangerous people. The fear that gnawed at him only fueled his determination. The deeper the investigation went, the more personal it became. It wasn't just about the story anymore. It was about what happened next. What would he do if they were coming for him? Daniel tried to get back to work, but the sense of unease that had settled over him like a dark cloud made it impossible to concentrate. He began to notice things that he hadn't before. Small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared to be part of a much larger picture. His phone started acting strangely. Strange noises on the line. Calls that would drop, inexplicably. He couldn't help but feel that someone was listening in on his conversations, waiting for him to slip up. He had always been careful with his research, but now, every step he took felt like a risk. A few days later, Martin contacted him. He sounded distant, his voice almost muffled as though he were speaking from a place far removed from their usual conversations. Daniel could hear the tension in his voice as soon as he answered. "You need to back off, Daniel," Martin said, his words urgent and clipped. "This isn't a game anymore. You've gone too far." Daniel's mind raced. "What do you mean? We're so close, Martin. We're uncovering the truth. We just need to push a little further." "No," Martin replied, his tone growing more desperate. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you and me. There are people who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. You're putting yourself in danger." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "I can handle it. I have to finish this. We're so close to exposing everything." Martin fell silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't think you realize what you're up against. These people, they control everything. You think you're just writing a story, but this is a war, and you're walking right into it." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He stared at the phone in disbelief, the weight of Martin's words sinking in. What was he really getting into? How far had he fallen into this trap, and was there any way to climb back out? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Martin had been right. He wasn't just chasing a story anymore. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The pressure continued to mount as the days passed. He had no choice but to continue his investigation, even though every step he took seemed to bring him closer to an unknown danger. As he sifted through more documents, Daniel began to connect the dots between the people Jolie had been involved with, and it all led back to one name that kept surfacing: Gabriel Carter. Carter was a figure that appeared in the most unlikely places: business deals, arms trades, political maneuvering, but there was no solid evidence connecting him directly to Jolie. Yet every time Daniel looked closer, he found new pieces of the puzzle: a phone call, a meeting, a transaction. The threads of the story were coming together, but so were the risks. Daniel could feel the walls closing in. It was then that he made the decision to confront Jolie directly. He had to find out what was going on, what she was hiding, and why she had become entangled in this dangerous web. But even as he prepared to reach out to her, something inside him knew that this was the point of no return. If Jolie was involved with Carter and the people behind him, then they were not going to let him walk away from this. In the days that followed, Daniel continued to gather more information, but the world around him seemed to shift. People started acting differently. Sources refused to talk. Others went silent altogether. He could feel the isolation creeping in, a slow realization that he was no longer in control of the story, if he ever had been. The investigation had become something larger than him, something that was no longer his to finish. The message had been clear: stop looking. But Daniel couldn't stop. He was already too deep. He just hoped he would survive long enough to finish what he had started. By the time Daniel fully understood the magnitude of what he was up against, it was far too late to back out. Each day that passed pushed him further into a corner, and the longer he tried to gather evidence, the more it seemed like the forces behind this twisted web were systematically erasing every step he took. The closer he came to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Now, it was no longer just about exposing Angelina Jolie's secret life. It was about survival. Daniel had barely slept for days. The investigation had consumed him, and it became clear that everything he thought he knew about the story was just the tip of the iceberg. As he sifted through the last pieces of evidence, the puzzle began to take shape, revealing a complex network of power, influence, and corruption. But with every connection he uncovered, he also felt the pressure mounting around him. He wasn't just a journalist anymore, he was a target. The night before, he had received another chilling message. It was simple, yet it had a weight to it that sent a cold shiver down his spine. A single photo, one of him and Martin, taken at the diner they frequented. He had recognized the location instantly. The image was taken at such a distance that it could have been captured by anyone with a decent lens. And what was more unsettling was the timestamp. Just hours after he had last met with Martin. The message was clear. They knew everything. Despite the warnings, Daniel continued. He knew that the people behind this, Gabriel Carter and the shadowy figures tied to him, had a reach far beyond anything he had ever encountered. Their influence stretched from Hollywood to political powerhouses, and it became increasingly evident that Jolie was merely a pawn in a much larger game. But even though Daniel understood the danger, he couldn't walk away. The truth had become an obsession, and it was one he couldn't shake. Then came the call. It was early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a thin light across his cluttered desk. He hadn't been expecting it, but as soon as he saw the number on the screen, he knew it was important. The voice on the other was distorted, too altered for Daniel to recognize the person on the other end immediately. But it didn't take long for him to piece together the significance of the call. "You need to stop," the voice warned. It was low, deliberate. "Everything you're digging into is already out of your control. You've crossed a line you can't uncross. Walk away now, and we might let you live." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he stood firm. He knew he couldn't back down now. He had come too far, risked too much to stop just because of an anonymous threat. His response was firm, the weight of his own resolve settling. "On him, I'm not walking away, not until I know the truth." The line went silent for a moment, and for a brief second Daniel thought the call had ended. Then the voice returned. "You think you have control of this situation. You don't, and soon you'll realize that you never did." And then the line went dead. That was the moment Daniel knew for sure that there was no going back. He had been warned, and yet his determination had only deepened. He wasn't going to stop until he had the answers. He didn't know if he would survive what was coming, but the investigation had become more than just a story. It was a war, and he was already too deep in it. In the days that followed, Daniel felt the walls closing in even more. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a palpable sense of dread that hung over him like a dark cloud. It was as if the entire city had turned against him, and no matter where he looked, he saw shadows lurking just beyond his peripheral vision. Martin had stopped responding to his calls. His apartment had been emptied, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Daniel knew that something had happened to him. Something had forced him to disappear. But the truth was, Daniel didn't have the luxury of stopping. He was alone now, left to pick up the pieces of an investigation that had spiraled far out of control. One evening, as Daniel sat at his desk, piecing together the final details of his investigation, the door to his apartment creaked open. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He hadn't heard anyone enter. For a moment everything seemed still, the silence stretching on. He reached for the drawer where he kept his phone, his hand shaking as he felt around for the device. The room was dark, but the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor was unmistakable. The door to his office opened. A figure stood there in the doorway, their outline blurred by the darkness. Daniel couldn't make out the face, but he could tell from the silhouette that it wasn't someone he recognized. "I was hoping you'd be here," the figure said. Their voice smooth and cold. It was a voice Daniel couldn't place, but there was something about it that immediately struck a chord of recognition deep in his chest. This was not a random visitor. This was someone who had been watching him for a while. Daniel didn't move. He didn't know what to do, whether to fight or flee. His mind raced as he tried to assess the situation, but before he could react, the figure stepped forward, revealing a face that sent a chill through his spine. It was Gabriel Carter, the man whose name had haunted every corner of his investigation, the man who was tied to everything he had uncovered, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. "I think you've reached the end of the road, Daniel," Carter said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've been asking questions you shouldn't have been asking, digging into things that don't concern you. And now, well, now we're going to make sure it stays that way." Daniel's mind raced. He had come so far, but now he could see the full extent of the web he had fallen into. Carter wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just someone with powerful connections. He was the architect of a system designed to bury the truth. And Daniel had been foolish enough to think he could expose it. But even now, Daniel didn't give up. He didn't let fear take over. His hands were trembling, but his voice remained steady as he stared Carter down. "You think you can stop me? I'm already too far in. There's no going back now." Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, sharp edge of someone who had long ago lost their humanity. "I'm not here to stop you, Daniel," Carter replied. "I'm here to show you that you've already lost." The figure behind Carter stepped forward, revealing another person, a man Daniel recognized as one of the shadowy figures who had been lurking in the background of his investigation. This man's face was hard, cold, with no trace of emotion. And then it happened. Daniel felt the pressure behind his eyes, the sudden weight of the world crashing down on him. The man's hands were quick, too quick, and before Daniel could react, everything went black. When he woke up, he was alone. The room was empty and the door had been left ajar. His phone was gone. His laptop had been wiped clean. The investigation, everything he had worked for, was gone. The truth was out of reach, and Daniel realized with a sickening clarity that the story he had been chasing was never his to tell. It was buried now, permanently, hidden behind layers of secrecy, corruption, and power. And as he stumbled out of his apartment, Daniel knew that there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Some stories were never meant to be told. Some truths were too dangerous to expose. In the end, the price of knowing too much was a life taken in silence, swallowed by the very darkness Daniel had tried to uncover.